So sit in a relaxed way, your feet planted on the floor. Close your eyes. Touch the person next to you. And just to get back to the point where we were last time, that the important point to say is that usually when you close your eyes and you try to let go of a lot of the stimulation, you are pointed inwardly. While in this case, because you're touching somebody else, you actually find yourself somehow outside and in a world that you share with other beings. So you're not actually trying to escape the world and everybody else in there, but you are just trying to suspend judgment about as much of your natural judgments and your natural way of thinking. And then when you do that, this is sometimes what we call the phenomenological reduction. When you are doubting enough stuff and when you are really trying to focus on the most basic, fundamental state that you can, then you find yourself defined to yourself as a being, and because you are not deflected inwardly but outwardly, so you are in a situation of being in the world, a being among other beings. This is what should be remembered now. Okay, so now you can open your eyes and we can continue now. So the phenomenology, according to some of the definitions, is concerned with self-showing things. That's the concern of phenomenology. And in order for something to be self-showing, we need another element in a very basic setup, and this is light. We need something is in order for something to be self-showing, there has to be a light that allows the thing to be self-showing. So I'm just going to use this light, and I'm going to talk a little bit what does the light, the existence of light, what does it add to the picture. So what you have to think about is that in this picture, the world is divided into light area and dark area. This is the basic structure or character of this world where you are. And when the light shines on one of you, you go from one phase to another phase of being. And we will talk a little bit what kind of a phase of being is the phase of being when you are exposed to light. And when you're exposed to light, then you become a self-showing thing, and therefore the part of the object of, or the concerns of phenomenology. So what I want you to think about is what happens when you go from darkness to light. That's the first thing that I want you to kind of think about. So the first thing to say is that if the basic concern of phenomenology is self-showing things, and in order to be self-showing you need light, then light is part of the immanent description of things according to the phenomenological framework, which is kind of interesting. So you get a sense of like a world that is divided into light part and into dark part. And if you are in the light part, then you yourself become self-showing. If you're in the dark side, you are not self-showing. So you really go from one phase to another phase depending on whether there's a light on you or there isn't any light on you. In the shadows, things do not show themselves. So when you go from a light area to a shadow area, you have to kind of think inwardly, what does it mean that you become self-showing thing? Now, to be self-showing is to be accessible to other beings, let's say. So therefore, to be self-showing means a heightened attention to the fact that you share the world with other beings. And there's this thing called the light that kind of go through. And this light, whenever the light shines on you, when you become accessible to others, you become conscious of two things. First of all, your sense of yourself changes a little bit. But the main reason why it changes a little bit is because you become accessible to others, and therefore in the self-showing, although it sounds like you talk about the self, there's already some kind of acknowledgement or heightened awareness of the connection to others. So the self-showing thing connects you to the world further by reminding you that you become accessible to other things, and therefore you become the subject of their thoughts and ideas, etc. So the thing that shows itself is in a different phase or mode of being. This is also something that you kind of should think about. What happens to you when you're under the limelight? You know, like almost literally. What is that thing that happens? This does not mean that you like it or that you don't like it. I think that we acknowledge the fact that there are really four different moods about lights and darkness. The first one is that you're in the dark and you want to be in the dark. The second thing is that you're in the dark and you want to be in the light. The third thing is that you're in the light and you want to be in the dark. And the last one, that you're in the light and you want to be in the light. So each of these four possibilities is actually stands for a very basic sense of being in the world, because if you're in the darkness and you want to be in the light, that means that you kind of yearn to be accessible to others. There's something about being in the shadows and being inaccessible that disturbs you, and you want to be accessible to others. We recognize this as a basic attitude towards the world. And because we are speaking about phenomenology, we take these attitudes very seriously, and so we think about each of these four things as being in a slightly different state of being or phase. We'll come back to that. So another thing is that we said that when the light shines on you, you are self-showing and accessible to others. And the other thing to say is that when you perceive other things as self-showing, you perceive them as self-showing. That's another, it sounds like a very trivial thing to say, but it really isn't, because what we call this basic metaphysical attitude is something that anybody who has access to you has this sense that now you are, when you are looking at perceiving something self-showing, then you say to yourself, I'm now, I have access to someone who's opening themselves up so other can access it. So it's not as if there's any point where there's no real point where you say it's self-showing, but it doesn't. But I don't perceive it as self-showing, as if I could really choose. There is no choice. When I see something, I see it as something that shows itself. Okay, so let's. So when we were talking about self-showing, it seemed very appropriate to talk about people as self-showing, but people, of course, are not the only things that are supposed to be self-showing. So the question is, what does it mean that we perceive it a stone or something, and we perceive it as self-showing? Because it seems like we cannot assign any kind of an intention to the stone the way we assign the intention to other people. So the question is, if we're talking about self-showing as a very general metaphysical attitude, then the question is, how does it apply to stones, for example, or to other things that we perceive as self-showing? So here I would like to use Heideggerian terms, Unverborgenheit, unconcealment. This is a very important concept because it means that the self-showing thing is something that unconceals something. So, so that way of looking at it looks at life in the shadow as concealment and life in the light as unconcealment. So it begins to be a little bit more specific, the distinction, and a little bit more meaningful. Unverborgenheit. So the beginning of the answer of what happens when you look at a stone and the stone is self-showing, and you say that the stone is unconcealing, what happens then? Then the answer is that, the phenomenological answer is that you look at the world and you say that the world opened up to me at that point, and what I'm seeing is an episode of unconcealment, that the world opened itself up. So now I can actually get access some of the things in the world and see them as self-showing. And in this way, you kind of bypass the issue of the intention of the stones and stuff, and you really think about the entire world around you is divided between concealed and unconcealed things. And the light moves certain things from the concealed category to the unconcealed category. Now, the issue of the concept of unconcealment is an important one because according to Heidegger, unconcealment, he identifies it with the Greek terms aletheia and says that unconcealment is the most fundamental notion of truth, generally. And the argument that he makes to that effect is something like that. He says that usually when we talk about truth, we talk about correspondence between, let's say, a proposition and a fact. So we say this proposition is true if it corresponds rightly to a true fact. This is the usual definition like that you learn in logic or philosophy of knowledge. And what Heidegger says is that before we can talk about correspondent to a fact, if we don't want it to be a circular argument, then the fact has to be something that is itself not really linguistic, but something that the sentence corresponds to. So what can that be, this fact that the proposition corresponds to? So this is exactly what Heidegger suggests, this idea of the basic concept of truth is the world opening up in some parts, and these parts become accessible to you, and these parts are the basic truths that you get, that you perceive, let's say. Now, that does not mean that you cannot make mistakes, and it does not mean that sometimes things look different than they are. All these things, of course, are possible. But when you are walking around in the dark place, and then there's a spot, and then you see a stone or some constellation of things, when you perceive them, you say that the world opened up for you, and then you receive some basic truth in an undigested way somehow. When you receive them in this kind of undigested way, then language can articulate them, and then we can begin to talk about correspondence between the proposition and the fact itself. But first you have to understand the notion of truth as unconcealment, that you look in this dark, and then there's one spot that is light, and you look at it, and there's some constellation of things there, and these things under the spotlight are places where the world unconcealed to your benefit, and these you regard as the most elementary type of truth that you can possibly conceive of. That's a kind of an important point. So what happens when there's this sense of unconcealment? It's not absolutely clear what happens. Does that mean that you see everything? Does that mean that you see things without using concepts? Does that mean that you see some things that you can never doubt later? None of these things is necessarily true. But the point of phenomenology generally is that we recognize from our experience these moments where the world opens up and unconcealed, and we see it as such. And when that happens, then we are getting something. We have access to parts of the world that we did not have access to before. Yes. So now, what happens during the unconcealment? So we usually experience this moment of unconcealment as something like receiving a transmission, that we received a transmission. That's how, this is the experience. We feel passive, it's like a more or less passive receptivity. That's how Kant would describe it. In phenomenology, they're a little bit more careful about the use of such things, but what guarantees that truthfulness, the truth that you access when you encounter an episode of unconcealment, you experience as a transmission that comes to you. And in order to get the transmission as clearly with the least distortion as possible, then you have to empty yourself out a little bit and to put aside a lot of things that are your baggage in order to be able to be, for the transmission, to be as undisturbed, what they call noiseless, try to make yourself into a noiseless channel, as they say in information theory. Why? Because insofar as the very fact that we are trying to go after those areas in the world where there's some opening, and we'll ask, well, why do we even bother doing it? But if we really do have this desire to see those places where the world unconceals itself, then you are trying to avoid situation where your own predisposition and interest are going to make the transmission too dependent on things about you rather than whatever does the transmission. So this is a little bit my interpretation, that because those of you who were in the lectures that we had about Kant's aesthetics might recall the idea that according to Kant, in a situation of an aesthetic judgment, you are trying to get at the object, and in order to do that, you set aside all sorts of things that disturb you from seeing the object itself. So you try to put aside your interests. It doesn't really matter because your interest might make you see things a little bit differently. And you also try to put aside your dispositions because let's say if you are like magenta objects and you look at this object as something that is a magenta thing, then you are coming into the situation with some preconception and predisposition, which in turn will make it more difficult to get the transmission from the object to you as noiseless as possible. So I'm trying to kind of assimilate a little bit these two scenarios together. And what I'm saying is that I'm describing an attitude of a thirst for unconcealment, a thirst for access to the world, a thirst for reception, a thirst for a situation where you will feel more connected to the world in virtue of becoming a noiseless channel of the world. So this has a lot to do with feeling one with the world. I mean, this situation where we find an opening up of the world and then we focus on it, we look at it in its transmission, we put aside our own baggage, we try to get the transmission as noiselessly as possible. So when that happens, then you feel immediately more connected to the environment in virtue of the transmission that you are building. Okay, so you should start thinking about what does it actually mean? What is this thirst, and why are we so find ourselves when we come out of the darkness? Why do we have this desire for the light, not necessarily on us, but on others, to access unconcealment that happens in the places where the world opens itself to you. So think about it. Why is it that we are, what kind of a mentality is it that really makes it so exciting and to be in a situation where you perceive the world, where you access stuff, and you just get to be connected because you are a noiseless receiver of transmission from outside. Yeah. So now, so there's this is connected to one of the questions that we were asking last time about the nature of what we called last time this phenomenological reduction, when we try to ignore as much of the rules that usually govern our behavior and try to put ourselves a little bit behind and to try to get to the most elementary part of experience that you can. So there are really different types of descriptions of this situation, and as I was saying, that one guy called Fink described it as retrieving the wonder, the sense of wonder that you become, that when you find yourself just cannot getting enough of what the world can give you, then one way to see it is that you retrieve the sense of wonder from the world. And in order to do that, I think that it's quite imperative to kind of try to get rid of your own baggage, because if you become very self-aware of your own determination, that the transmission that you get are actually at least partially produced by your own characteristic rather than by the opening up of the world. So we are describing this kind of sense of joy and wonder as at least partially the result of our ability to throw our own baggage aside and to focus on something that amounts to a real external connection. This is a very important point here. And part of this process of avoiding various normal things, like I like things that I own, therefore I just try to look at things that I own, or some things that I think if I like, let's say, dogs or cats, I'm just like focusing on dogs or cats. So sometimes it's about what we own, sometimes it is about the concept that we use before we cannot decide whether we're going to focus on something or not. So my point is that when you really try to get to a point to kind of reclaim the wonder, then you have to also decrease the level of the use of concepts, at least when you have the experience. You really try to open yourself up and try to create the automatization and try to avoid looking at things through the perspective of certain concepts, and try to get the transmission as concept-free as possible. That's what part of the process that we are talking about.
So like trying something for the first time?
Yes. Just allowing yourself to be open up to something that you see as something completely unique. You don't use concept to describe it. You just allow this meeting to be as intense as possible. And what you are trying to do is just to get the transmission. And the next thing that happens is that the same joy that attracts you to the object is also will motivate the idea of continuing the transmission, to become a channel that will continue streaming the same thing that you get in, to kind of stream it out to other people. That is an important part of it, which brings us to photography. So, if we started by describing a situation of we are in a world where we are being that shares the world with other being, and then there's some rays of light that catch some of the stuff but not other stuff, and we have this thirst to access as much as possible, so we put a lot of our own baggage outside so we can get as much noiseless transmission as possible. And the idea is that to continue the transmission so other people can get the same transmission that you got. So at this point you can add, and this is where photography gets in. And photography is kind of very strange when you think about it, because it seems that it really fits in a very interesting way to the concern of phenomenology, because it is only sensitive to light and dark. It's sensitive to light and dark, and only to light and dark. So whenever you find yourself in a situation where you say, the world opens up to me, and now I can access it, you can also photograph it. And this is kind of interesting. That it so happens that these two notions kind of intersect in a very interesting way. So to recap the entire arc of reasoning, so the idea is that you walk around the world with a camera, and then you are trying to find these places that are really evocative, where the world opens up for you, and then you empty yourself out, and then you try to get the transmission, and then you want to continue, and then you have the camera that allows you exactly to continue this process of taking the transmission and continuing it to other people so they can see what you see, and they can feel your joy, and they can feel your wonder. But the things that, so the question can be, now, what would motivate you to photograph like one thing rather than another thing in this very, very basic framework that we're working with? And there are really different answers. They really are. There are really nice. There's a description, for example, that that Warhol writes about when he talks about the first time that he takes a car trip to the West. He goes from New York to Los Angeles with some guys in a car, and they go across the country. Now, if you've been to New York, you know that New York is very vertical and very dense, so when you come out of the city anyway, you really have a sense of relief. You see a horizon, you see, that's anyway the case. But the way Warhol was describing it, he said, like, so he had really a moment of wonder, and he was saying, wow, he loved everything. He loved the neon signs, and he loved the sunsets, and he loved the billboards, and he loved the cars, and he loved everything. That's how he kind of described this situation. It like put him in a state of wonder where everything was beautiful. And you know, that's how he used to talk. Everything is great, everything is beautiful. You know, that's very Warhol-esque to think about it that way. And so this is like one version of how it happened, that you absolutely love everything. like almost in an unqualified way. And the main thing that you just have to make sure that when you do the selection, that you will really not like undermine your own complete openness to the world that you find yourself by choosing things like that the selection would somehow express yourself too much and will not have this kind of noiseless character of just like taking things in and more or less like continue this transmission that you get in the most direct and way possible. So to a certain extent, this was like Warhol's version of the story. That for him it was, and for many pop artists, it was breaking down the boundaries between art and life. So he thought about it a little bit that you were a little bit too, your judgment and your taste were a little bit, not just a little bit, maybe more than a little bit, are too much determined by a kind of regimented thinking that does not allow you, for example, to perceive the beauty of things that belong to different categories. So he really, from his point of view, always kind of emphasized the fact. That's how he thought about how he selected the objects that he silk screened, and he just thought that everything is great, everything is beautiful. I just need to continue transmitting them in the most straightforward, mechanical way, and this was kind of his view of photographic material. Now, this is really just like one interpretation, but it's kind of interesting that he emphasizes like this like a very authentic sense of joy and wonder that he experienced like with the car getting outside New Jersey. So all of a sudden you start seeing the horizon line and the great sunsets and the neon sign and all the stuff that you see on the American highway. That he really describes it in ways that are very close, to some extent, to this situation that we are trying to describe. But anybody has something to say about maybe it's not the best way to think about it? The problem is the use of concept that it seems that you're seeing everybody as a kind of reduce it to some kind of a wonderful environment, but you really get stuck in all the there's text and there are all sorts of iconography, and there's a lot of things that you take into consideration when you do this Warhol thing. And there was a second generation of people who had the same idea of breaking down boundaries between art and life, who had a different interpretation of the situation, and they really, and these were people like Robert Morris and the early minimalists, who were kind of, they had a strange relation to pop art, because on the one hand, they liked the seriality, they liked the idea that we were just describing of how to look at the whole world with a sense of wonder. They liked that, but they thought that you really need to go beyond these categories that are immanent to advertisement and to the kind of stuff that he used. So they really wanted to get to an even more fundamental position where you are seeing anything as a kind of in terms of volumes, in terms of weight, in terms of how your body is related in size to certain thing, and how the size, when you try to move them, are actually determined, the way that the object is moved, and very much in relation to the dimensions of the body. So this was a kind of a second interpretation of these ideas. If you read the article about phenomenology after conceptual art, that you can see, you can read precisely about how they interpreted about the post-pop interpretation of this moment of joy and wonder. But going back to photography, so the idea is that, and strangely enough, I mean, I'm really not an expert about phenomenology. I started reading this stuff relatively recently, so there's a lot of things I don't know. But I'm surprised that there is not something much more specific to the photography from the point of view of phenomenology, for the reason that I mentioned before, that phenomenology really talks about these a world where the two phases of beings in that world correspond to light and dark, and one is in a position of like concealment and inaccessibility. The others are opening up and creating accessibility, the possibility of accessibility to other. So, and in order to, if you want to feel a closer relation to the world, then you become really engaged in trying to find in the world those places that opened up for you. And these are all metaphysical concepts, really having to do with the most basic type of action and attitude in a world, again, populated by beings that share the world with other beings. Some of them have the spotlight, others don't, but so it's kind of, this is, so far, is a metaphysical description. And it's interesting that photography is sensitive precisely to the light, to the differences between light and darkness, and that's why, in my opinion, it should have a very interesting status vis-a-vis phenomenology. The other thing about the camera is that it does not use concept, and therefore the idea of course, you don't always get noiseless photographic transmission, but at the very least, the whole process seems to bypass a lot of our mental faculties that we are actually trying to get rid of, as we were talking about before, in order to get to this unmediated relation to the world. So photography kind of helps you because it does not use concept, and it seems like basically perfectly built in order to kind of transcribe a moment of the world opening up in a manner that can then be transmitted further to others. So yes, so let's finish at this point now. So until next time. Any questions? Okay, I guess we're through. The artist is usually in the shadow looking at the light, but you can get it. But by continuing the transmission, it becomes entangled with the things that happen in the light. Because the transmission of things that happen in the light, so we continue transmitting it, you become entangled with the things that you transmit. So that means that you are not really in the dark, that you are in another phase.
Because in the dark we're not opening up.
Yes, exactly. And now we will discuss a little bit more. As I was saying, some people, some things in the dark want to stay in the dark. Some things in the dark want the light. Some things that are in the light want to go back to the dark. And sometimes those in the light want to continue in the light. So these are like four attitudes, and it depends a little bit which of them the artists take. You know, because that will determine, exactly how the artist will look at the relation to the shadow and to the light. You're not sure?
No, I'm not sure yet, but I haven't thought about it much.
Okay, let's continue with that next time. Good.